At 1 minute past midnight, a 50% tax on $20 billion of Canadian goods switched on automatically, and almost nobody in Washington was celebrating. Wine, cement, furniture, hockey sticks, fishing rods, all of it suddenly cost half, again as much the moment it crossed the border. This wasn't a plan coming together. This was a trade deal collapsing in real time. And within 72 hours, some of the loudest voices admitting it had gone wrong weren't in Ottawa. They were in Washington, on Fox affiliates, inside Republican press releases, and on the front page of the Washington Post. To understand how a trade relationship between two of the closest allies on Earth ended up here, you have to go back to February of 2025, when this fight didn't even start over trade numbers. It started over fentanyl. The Trump administration invoked emergency powers under a law called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, arguing that Canada wasn't doing enough to stop the flow of the drug across the northern border. Canadian and American government data at the time showed something inconvenient for that argument. Less than 0.1% of fentanyl seized entering the United States over the previous several years had come through Canada. The overwhelming majority came through Mexico. The tariffs went ahead anyway, and by April 2025, on what the administration branded Liberation Day, a second justification was added: the trade deficit itself framed as decades of Canada taking advantage of the United States. That legal foundation didn't hold. On February 20th, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the president could not use those emergency powers to impose tariffs at all, striking down a large share of what had been placed on Canadian goods since 2025. It looked, briefly, like a turning point. But tariffs resting on other legal authorities, steel and aluminum duties under Section 232 and a separate mechanism called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, were untouched by that ruling, and it's those tools that have driven everything that's happened since. There's a structural reason 2026 specifically became the year this all boiled over, and it has nothing to do with any single tariff announcement. The USMCA, known in Canada as CUSMA, includes a built-in sunset clause that no prior American free trade agreement has ever had. Article 34. 7 required the three governments to hold a mandatory 6-year joint review exactly on July 1st, 2026, the 6th anniversary of the deal taking effect. At that meeting, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer confirmed the United States would not agree to renew the agreement in its current form, which, under the treaty's own rules, triggers annual reviews going forward rather than an automatic 16-year extension. The agreement doesn't collapse because of that. It stays in force until 2036 either way, unless someone formally withdraws. But it does mean 2026 was always going to be the year Washington used its leverage to try to rewrite the terms of North American trade before locking in another 16 years of them. That review clock, running in the background the entire time, helps explain why this year's tariff fights have had a harder edge than the rounds that came before. By the summer of 2026, relations were already fraying badly. In late June, President Trump terminated trade talks altogether, accusing Canada of misquoting Ronald Reagan in a domestic ad campaign against tariffs. In October, an additional 10% tariff landed on top of what was already there. And on July 20th, 2026, Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations invoking Section 338, imposing another 50% tariff on a specific list of Canadian products, wine, cement, and hockey sticks among them, set to take effect August 19th. That start date slipped once, to August 22nd, while both sides scrambled for a deal. That deal never came. Negotiators from both governments spent 3 days in Washington trying to close the gap before the deadline. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, met face-to-face with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer at USTR headquarters. Trump extended the clock once in an 11th-hour Truth Social post, giving negotiators 3 extra days. It wasn't enough. Talks broke down late on the night of Friday, August 21st, and at the stroke of midnight, the 50% tariffs on that $20 billion slice of Canadian exports, about 5.5% of everything Canada sends south, switched on. Prime Minister Mark Carney didn't mince words the next morning. Speaking in Ottawa, he called the breakdown a miscalculation and said the terms the United States had proposed in the final days were, in his words, uneconomic and unfair, and undermined the reliability of any deal at all. He said plainly that Washington had asked too much and offered too little. Within hours, he promised Canada would respond dollar for dollar. It did. On Tuesday, August 25th, Canada's government unveiled its own retaliatory package. Tariffs on more than 700 American products, worth roughly $20 billion, ranging from 15% up to 50%, set to take effect September 8th. Canada is doubling its duties on American steel and aluminum to 50%, matching what the U.S. had already imposed on Canadian metal. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne told reporters in Ottawa that the American duties would have real consequences for Canadian workers, businesses, and communities across the country. And notably, he didn't pretend the Canadian response would be painless either. Carney had already acknowledged, in the same breath as announcing retaliation, that hitting back would raise costs and reduce choice for Canadians too. This is a trade war with no clean winners, and both governments are, for once, being honest about that part. Then came the part that turned this from a bilateral dispute into a genuine political problem for the party currently running Washington. On Monday, August 24th, the same week the retaliatory tariffs were unveiled, Trump announced plans for a further 50% tariff, this time targeting all Canadian cars, trucks, auto parts, and steel. According to Washington Post reporting, that particular escalation isn't scheduled to take effect until January 1st, giving both sides several more months to find a way out. But the auto industry doesn't wait for deadlines to react, and neither did the market for words. Trump described Canada, in one Truth Social post, as easily the most difficult and unreasonable country he deals with. In another, he floated renaming Lake Ontario to Lake America. He has taken to calling Carney governor, a jab tied to his repeated suggestion that Canada should become the 51st state, a suggestion Canadians overwhelmingly reject, according to polling cited by CNN's fact-checking team. It's worth sitting for a moment on just how specific and, frankly, symbolic some of the targeted goods are. Hockey sticks and hockey equipment showing up on a formal U.S. presidential tariff proclamation is almost impossible to read as anything other than a pointed jab at Canadian national identity, whatever the underlying trade logic behind including sporting goods in a Section 338 list. Wine is a smaller Canadian export category by dollar value than steel or autos, but it's produced heavily in politically sensitive regions like Ontario's Niagara Peninsula and British Columbia's Okanagan Valley, meaning the economic pain from that particular line item concentrates in specific provincial economies rather than spreading evenly across the country. Furniture and cement tariffs hit manufacturing towns that don't often make international headlines, but depend heavily on cross-border sales to stay afloat. None of these sectors individually rival the size of the auto or steel disputes, but together they signal an approach that's cast a wide net across Canadian industry, rather than narrowly targeting the specific sectors the administration says were treated unfairly. Here's where the script's headline claim stops being an opinion and starts being documented. Because it isn't just Canadian officials or foreign press calling this a backfire. It's American outlets, American fact-checkers, and American elected Republicans, on the record in their own words this week. Start with the fact-checking. CNN's Daniel Dale, going through a batch of Trump's Truth Social posts from Monday, August 24th, flagged what he called a remarkable number of falsehoods in a single string of posts. Trump claimed Canada's unemployment rate was 10% and rapidly rising. Statistics. Canada's own July 2026 labor force survey shows the real number, 6.4%, the lowest it's been since July 2024, with the Canadian economy adding 75,000 jobs that month alone. The unemployment rate wasn't rising, it had just fallen. The Canadian press ran its own fact file the same week, checking a separate string of claims that Canada conducts 95% of its business with the United States, when the real sourced figure for merchandise exports is 71.7% and falling, and that Canada has historically imposed 400% tariffs on American farmers, costing the U.S. $60 billion a year, when the tariffs in question are quota structures both countries negotiated and signed onto together, not a unilateral scheme to rip off anyone. Dale's fact check also noted Trump has previously and falsely claimed Canada doesn't purchase American agricultural products, when Canada is in fact the second largest buyer of U.S. agricultural exports in the world. That's not spin from a hostile source. That's arithmetic from Canada's own National Statistics Agency, checked against a sitting U.S. president's public statements by an American news network's dedicated fact-checking desk. Now to the political fallout, which is arguably the more damaging story for the White House because it's coming from inside the Republican Party itself. The Washington Post reported this week that the collapse of the trade deal, followed immediately by Trump's announcement of even more tariffs, landed as a fresh shock to midterm elections that were already being fought over the cost of living. Fortune's reporting on the situation is almost surreal in its own right. Even Trump's own trade representative, Jamieson Greer, has been publicly downplaying the tariffs he is simultaneously being asked to escalate, telling reporters the administration doesn't actually expect a huge impact from them. When your own top trade negotiator is quietly talking down the policy in public, that's not messaging discipline. That's daylight between the West Wing and the people executing its trade strategy. The Republican discomfort doesn't stop there. CNN Politics reported this week that Republicans are furious the tariff fight has flared back up just as midterm campaigning intensifies, with the party's own trade hawks and populists divided on how to respond. One prominent MAGA-aligned strategist, in a text message to a CNN reporter, summed up his reaction to the administration's beef import and Canada tariff moves in 2 words: hate it. The Hill reported that Trump's 50% tariffs on Canada are creating specific midterm problems for vulnerable Republican Senate candidates in border states, states where the economy is deeply intertwined with Canadian trade and where economic anxiety is already the dominant issue with voters. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, a Republican, put it about as bluntly as a sitting senator from the president's own party can put it. He warned that steep tariffs on Canadian goods threaten to disrupt the economies of border states like Maine, and argued the administration should be finishing trade relationships with Canada instead of creating volatility through what he called gimmicks. Tillis pointed out that with roughly 71 days left before the midterm elections at the time of his comments, Republicans didn't have a positive message for farm country. A farm bill and a $12 billion emergency assistance package for farmers were both stalled in the Senate, while the tariff fight escalated around them. Reporting from the New Republic, a left-leaning outlet worth noting as such, highlighted Wisconsin's 3rd congressional district as a case study, where a Democratic challenger running against a Republican incumbent has pointed to the state's dairy and farm equipment exports to Canada as directly exposed to retaliatory tariffs, arguing the fight will hit agricultural communities already squeezed by earlier rounds of trade conflict. Whatever your read on that outlet's politics, the underlying exposure, Wisconsin dairy and equipment exports sitting inside Canada's retaliation list, is a documented trade fact, not an opinion. Republican anxiety is also showing up in agriculture policy directly. ABC News reported that Republican lawmakers from cattle ranching states have criticized a separate Trump decision to temporarily allow more duty-free foreign beef into the country to ease meat prices for consumers, arguing it could hurt American ranchers precisely while the Canada dispute drags on. The White House, through spokesman Kush Desai, defended the overall approach, saying the president has repeatedly affirmed his support for American ranchers and farmers, and insisting that countless American workers and businesses had borne the brunt of what the administration calls Canada's lopsided trade relationship. That's the administration's stated position, and it deserves to be included alongside the criticism. This is a genuine two-sided argument about who has actually been taken advantage of in this relationship, not a settled question. Meanwhile, 4 border states in particular, Maine, Michigan, New Hampshire, and Alaska, along with manufacturing-heavy Ohio, sit at the exact intersection of competitive midterm races and deep economic ties to Canada, according to Reporting Review this week. In Maine specifically, where Senator Susan Collins faces a competitive re-election fight, her Democratic challenger, Troy Jackson, has already called the tariffs a direct tax on working families, arguing that anyone who has spent time working along that border understands how vital Canadian trade is to the state's economy. In Iowa, Republican Ashley Hinson, running for the Senate seat being vacated by Joni Ernst, publicly called a related beef import decision a bad idea that would only add more uncertainty and instability for farmers, while fellow Iowa Republican Zach Nunn, appearing at the Iowa State Fair alongside the Agriculture Secretary, tried to walk a middle line, saying the president was right that Americans need affordable food, but that it shouldn't come at ranchers' expense. Tennessee Republican Tim Burchett said he'd spent the week talking directly to small farmers and ranchers who'd bear the brunt of the administration's beef import decision. None of these are Democrats attacking from outside the party. These are sitting and campaigning Republicans on the record, describing their own president's trade strategy as a liability heading into their own elections. The scale of the response inside the Republican conference is itself notable. Beyond the individual senators and House members quoted above, the Hill's reporting describes a broader pattern of vulnerable GOP candidates in border states trying to create daylight between themselves and the administration's approach without directly breaking from the president, a delicate balancing act that reporters covering the midterms describe as increasingly difficult to maintain the longer the trade war drags on. The party's own polling, according to that same reporting, shows the economy remains the single most consistently top-ranked concern for voters of both parties, which is precisely why a self-inflicted trade fight with a top 5 trading partner is landing so badly with campaign strategists trying to keep the conversation focused elsewhere. So what does this actually mean for ordinary people on both sides of the border? CNN's business desk laid out the mechanics clearly. The overall cost of living in the United States is already up 3.4% from a year earlier, and any further escalation, particularly the threatened 50% tariff on Canadian autos, trucks, and parts, would add directly to price pressure on car buyers, since North American auto manufacturing is deeply integrated across the Canada-U.S. border. A Washington Post opinion piece this week didn't soften that point at all, arguing plainly that a 50% tariff on cars, trucks, parts, and steel from Canada would crush manufacturers in the United States and raise prices in both countries. while noting the one saving grace is that the January 1st start date leaves room for negotiators to defuse what the peace called an economic landmine before it detonates. Carney is navigating no shortage of pressure on his own side of the border, too. He came into office earlier in this dispute, promising a tougher, more disciplined response to Washington than his predecessor, and the dollar-for-dollar retaliation announced this week is very much in keeping with that posture. But acknowledging, as he did, that Canada's own countermeasures will raise costs and reduce choice for Canadian consumers is a politically risky thing for any Prime Minister to say out loud, even in the name of appearing honest. Opposition parties in Ottawa have already begun asking whether matching Washington tariff for tariff is actually the most effective strategy, or whether it simply guarantees pain on both sides without changing Washington's calculus. A genuine, unresolved debate inside Canadian politics that runs parallel to the one happening inside the Republican conference in Washington. Canada, for its part, has options beyond straightforward retaliatory tariffs, and its officials have started naming them out loud. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said in an interview this week that Canada should be prepared to cut off electricity exports to the United States if the trade war continues to worsen. Ontario currently supplies power to several American states, including New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, meaning a cutoff wouldn't be symbolic, it would show up on actual power grids. Carney echoed that posture directly, telling reporters in Ottawa that nothing is off the table. A former special advisor on Canada-U, S. Relations noted publicly that potash, a key ingredient in fertilizer that American farmers depend on, and broader energy exports are additional pressure points Canada could use if Washington escalates further with the threatened auto and steel tariffs come January. It's a pointed piece of leverage precisely because of who it would hit. American farmers, many in exactly the border and Midwest states where Republican senators are already nervous about their own re-election prospects. Cutting off or restricting potash wouldn't just be a symbolic gesture from Ottawa. It would land directly on the input costs of the same agricultural communities that Senator Tillis and others are already warning the party has no positive message for heading into November. There's also a domestic Canadian story running underneath all of this that rarely makes American headlines but matters enormously to understanding why Ottawa isn't backing down. Since February 2025, a grassroots boycott of American goods and travel has spread across Canada, driven by both the tariffs themselves and Trump's repeated talk of annexing the country as a 51st state. Canadians have canceled trips south of the border in large numbers. Buy Canadian campaigns have taken root in grocery stores and on store shelves. And interprovincial trade, historically hampered by Canada's own internal barriers, has been actively promoted as a substitute for reliance on the United States. Even Quebec's separatist movement, which has periodically pushed for independence from Canada itself, has said publicly it won't pursue a referendum while Trump remains in office, preferring, for now, national unity against outside pressure over an internal political fight. That's how deep the shift in Canadian public sentiment has gone. Financial markets have been tracking every twist of this story in real time as well. Bloomberg's markets coverage this week described Canada's retaliatory tariff announcement as a lead story-shaping investor sentiment heading into the trading day, even as attention elsewhere was split with corporate earnings season. None of this is happening in a vacuum where trade policy stays contained to two governments. Currency markets, cross-border manufacturers, and agricultural commodity prices are all pricing in the uncertainty of a dispute that keeps changing shape week to week. For a Canadian auto parts plant or an American dairy cooperative trying to plan production for next quarter, that uncertainty is arguably as costly as any single tariff rate, because neither side can be confident the current terms will still apply by the time a shipment actually crosses the border. It's worth pausing on the scale of what's actually at stake here, because it's easy to lose the forest for the individual tariff percentages. Canada and the United States traded more than $410 billion in goods in a recent full year, making it one of the largest bilateral trading relationships anywhere on the planet, built on decades of integrated supply chains, especially in the auto sector, where a single vehicle can cross the border multiple times during assembly before it's ever sold. That is the relationship currently being tested by proclamations, deadlines, and truth social posts. It's worth being precise about which tariffs are which, because the terminology gets thrown around loosely and the mechanisms actually matter for how this can end. The 50% tariffs that hit on August 22nd were imposed under Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a rarely used century-old provision that lets a president respond to what he determines is discriminatory treatment of American commerce, and it applies to the listed goods regardless of whether they'd otherwise qualify for preferential treatment under the USMCA. That's separate entirely from Section 232, the national security justification the administration has used for broader steel and aluminum tariffs since Trump's first term, which currently sit at 50% for most countries, though producers with facilities inside Canada or Mexico that supply American automakers can, under specific USMCA-related provisions, qualify for a reduced 25% rate instead, provided the material meets preferential rules of origin. On top of both of those, separate tariffs have applied since October 2025 on Canadian softwood lumber at 10% and on certain finished wood products like upholstered furniture and kitchen cabinets at 25%, a slice of the dispute that rarely makes headlines but has hit Canada's forestry-dependent provinces hard. Each of these tools has its own legal basis, its own exemptions, and its own political constituency lobbying either for or against it, which is part of why a single deal has proven so difficult to reach. There isn't one dispute to resolve. There are several running in parallel. The White House's own framing of all this, to be fair to their side of the argument, is that the administration has already struck 18 separate trade deals opening new markets for American exporters, and that Canada's tariff and quota structure on things like dairy has represented genuine discrimination against American products for years. Discrimination, the administration argues previous presidents simply tolerated. A White House fact sheet released this week pointed to Canada sending roughly 3/4 of its total goods exports to the United States as evidence of how dependent the Canadian economy is on continued American market access, and argued the new tariffs are about leveling a playing field that had tilted unfairly against U.S. commerce for years, particularly in autos, alcohol, and dairy. That framing is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. Dairy tariff rate quotas between the two countries are real. They were negotiated under trade agreements both governments signed, and reasonable people can disagree about whether they're fair. The mechanics matter here too. Canada doesn't charge a flat tariff on all American dairy products. It operates a tariff rate quota system, meaning a certain volume of dairy imports enters at low or zero tariffs, and only shipments above that negotiated volume face the steep over-quota rates Trump frequently cites. That system was itself a product of the original USMCA negotiations Trump's own first-term administration signed off on, which expanded American dairy access into Canada compared to the agreement it replaced. Whether that access should be expanded further is a legitimate question for the current joint review process to work through. Framing it as decades of one-sided theft when the structure was negotiated and signed by an American president is a harder claim to defend on the historical record alone. There's also a broader strategic context the administration points to that deserves airtime here. The same White House fact sheet crediting the Canada tariffs to fair trade principles also notes that the administration has struck 18 separate trade agreements with other countries over the past year and a half, opening new markets for American exporters elsewhere in the world. Supporters of the administration's approach argue Canada's resistance to matching those terms is precisely why Ottawa is facing tariffs when other trading partners aren't. Critics counter that Canada isn't a typical trading partner to begin with. It's a treaty ally bound to the U.S. by the USMCA specifically with supply chains, especially in autos, so deeply interwoven that a part can cross the border several times before a finished vehicle ever reaches a dealership. Treating that relationship the same way as a fresh negotiation with a country that had no prior agreement at all is, itself, part of what critics on both sides of the aisle in Washington say has made this dispute uniquely disruptive compared to the administration's other trade actions this term. What the fact-checking record doesn't support is the specific numbers Trump has attached to that argument this week. The 10% unemployment figure, the 95% trade dependency claim, and the 400% historic tariff figure have all been checked against government data by Canadian press and CNN and found to be inflated or incorrect. The underlying grievance about dairy quotas is a legitimate, arguable policy position. The specific statistics used to sell it to the American public this week, according to multiple named fact-checkers, are not accurate. So where does this actually leave things heading into September? Confirmed and verified, the U.S. tariffs on $20 billion of Canadian goods are already in effect as of August 22nd. Canada's retaliatory tariffs on more than 700 American products are confirmed to take effect September 8th. The threatened 50% tariff on Canadian autos, trucks, parts, and steel has been announced by the administration, but per current reporting, is not scheduled to take effect until January 1st, meaning it remains a threat and a negotiating lever rather than a locked-in policy, and could still be walked back, delayed again, or modified before then, the way earlier deadlines in this same dispute have been. Doug Ford's electricity cutoff comment is a stated position from Ontario's premier, not an announced government policy. Carney's "nothing is off the table" framing keeps that option open rhetorically without committing to it. And whether this dispute damages Republican prospects in November the way Senator Tillis and others fear, or gets resolved with a deal before voters go to the polls, is genuinely unknown. That's forecasting, not fact, however many senators are worried about it right now. What is settled and worth restating plainly is the through line running from February 2025 to this week in August 2026. A trade relationship between two countries that have rarely fought like this in modern history has now gone through a Supreme Court rebuke of the legal basis for some of the tariffs, multiple rounds of escalation and partial retaliation, a currently in effect 50% tariff hit on both sides, a further threatened round aimed squarely at the auto industry, and now, this week specifically, an unusually public admission from American fact-checkers, from American business reporters, and from sitting Republican senators that the political and economic costs of this approach are landing closer to home than the administration would like. Zoom out far enough, and the strangeness of the moment becomes even clearer. Canada and the United States share the longest undefended border in the world, a decades-old joint air defense command in NORAD, and a security and economic partnership that survived the Cold War, multiple recessions, and nearly a century of shifting global politics without a rupture like this one. That history is exactly why so much of the current commentary, from fact-checkers, from business reporters, from the president's own party, keeps landing on the word backfire rather than strategy. A trade dispute with a country the U.S. has no historical rivalry with, no security tension with, and an enormous, deeply integrated manufacturing relationship with, doesn't usually generate this kind of bipartisan discomfort inside the party currently in power. When Republican senators start comparing notes with Democratic challengers about which border state industries are exposed, and when a sitting president's own trade representative is downplaying the very policy he's implementing, that's not the profile of a negotiating tactic working as intended. The sourcing behind everything in this script includes Al Jazeera and NBC News on the tariff timeline and Carney's statements, CNBC and CNN Business on the retaliatory tariff package and its potential impact on American consumers, The Washington Post on the political fallout for Republicans and the economic analysis of the threatened auto tariffs, Fortune on USTR Jameson Greer's public comments downplaying the tariffs' impact, CNN's Daniel Dale and a separate Canadian Press fact file, both published this week, on the specific false and misleading claims about Canadian unemployment, trade dependency, and historic tariff rates. The Hill, ABC News, and CNN Politics on Republican reaction and midterm exposure, comments from Senator Tom Tillis reported via Yahoo News and other wire coverage, the White House's own fact sheet, and spokesman statements for the administration's stated position, and Statistics Canada's July 2026 labor force survey as the underlying government data source for the unemployment fact check. One outlet referenced for Republican side commentary, PJ Media, is an openly pro-Trump opinion site rather than a straight news source, and its framing is presented here as opinion commentary, not verified fact. Similarly, Daily Kos and the New Republic lean left editorially, and where their framing goes beyond documented facts, it's flagged as opinion rather than presented as neutral reporting. What remains genuinely unresolved and worth watching, whether the January 1st auto tariff deadline holds, gets delayed again, or gets negotiated away entirely, whether Ontario's electricity threat ever becomes actual policy rather than a stated option, and whether the political damage Republican senators are warning about actually materializes at the ballot box in November, or fades as a news cycle the way earlier rounds of this same fight have faded before. If you've been following this trade relationship since it first flared up back in early 2025, you'll know how many times a final deadline in this saga has turned out not to be final at all, which is exactly why it's worth having this channel in your corner for what comes next. Between now and September 8th, when Canada's retaliation actually lands, and January 1st, when the threatened auto tariffs are supposed to kick in, there are a lot of moving pieces still to track, and this is the place that will keep tracking every single one of them as they're confirmed, not as they're rumored. If today's breakdown told you anything, it's that these situations shift fast, and the headlines often lag behind what's actually happening on the ground. So, if you want the next update the moment it's verified, rather than days later, subscribing is the simplest way to make sure it reaches you. And if you've made it this far into a story with this many moving parts, there's a good chance you're exactly the kind of viewer this channel is built for. Someone who wants the sourcing, not just the soundbite, so consider sticking around and subscribing for the next one, because a story that's already reversed course this many times in 18 months is almost certainly not done yet. So here's the honest, open question worth sitting with. Is this actually a strategy that eventually forces a better deal for the United States, the way the administration insists it will? Or is it a self-inflicted wound that ends up costing American consumers, farmers, and factory workers more than it ever costs Canada? Reasonable people, including plenty of Republican senators quoted this week, seem to be genuinely split on that question. Let me know where you land in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.